They took the combine first, then the grain truck, then the disc, the baler, the welder, and every tool with a serial number. But when the two bankmen stepped into the far end of my barn, they stopped beside an old walking plow leaning against the wall, and a sway-backed draft horse chewing hay like the whole world had not just ended. One of them looked at the plow, then at the horse. "Leave those," he said. "They're not worth the fuel." That was the last honest mistake the bank ever made with me. I stood in the doorway of my Kansas farmhouse with an eviction paper folded in my fist, and watched 22 years of work crawl away on flatbed trailers. The farm was 270 acres of dry land ground outside Gray County, the kind of place where wheat lived or died by the mercy of clouds. I had bought it young, paid it down slow, and believed hard work could outlast bad weather. Then 3 brutal seasons came back to back. Hail stripped one crop clean. Heat burned the next one before the heads filled. My youngest boy's hospital bills finished what the sky started. By September, my wife Mara had taken our children to her mother's place in Wichita. She did not leave because she stopped loving me. She left because she could not watch the phone ring every morning and see me shrink smaller with every collector's voice. The farm went quiet after they left. Too quiet. The rooms still held the shape of our life, but not the life itself. There were nail holes where family pictures had hung, a dent in the kitchen floor where my daughter had dropped a skillet, pencil marks on the pantry door showing how tall the boys had grown each spring. And outside, the bank was hauling away the proof that I had once been a real farmer. I had $96 in my pocket, 1 change of clothes, 1 old plow, and a horse named Mercy that nobody wanted because she was 24 years old and stubborn enough to bite a gate latch off the post. The bank believed they had taken everything useful, but men who only read numbers never understand what still has value when the machines are gone. I could have gone to town. Plenty of people said I should. Get a room over the hardware store, sweep floors, start fresh where nobody had to see what I had lost. Instead, I carried my bedroll to a stone pump house that sat on the section line beyond the foreclosed acres. It had no heat, no glass in one window, and a roof that clicked all night when the wind came through. But it was dry, it was legal, and from the doorway I could still see the fields that used to be mine. That first week, I walked farm roads asking for day work. Some men gave me odd jobs because they pitied me. Some would not meet my eyes. A few spoke to me like foreclosure was contagious. The one who mattered was Nolan Price. Nolan farmed a half-section east of town and owned a strip of gumbo bottomland along the creek that no tractor wanted to touch. In wet years, it swallowed tires. In dry years, it baked into plates hard enough to wring under a shovel. Cottonwoods had crept in along the edges, and wild sunflower stood shoulder high. He found me one evening mending a broken fence for $5 and a sack of potatoes. "Caleb," he said, "you still got that old horse?" I told him I did. "And that iron plow your father kept?" I nodded. He looked toward the creek ground, like he had already made peace with being laughed at. "I've got 32 acres down there. Nobody has made pay in 10 years. My big rigs sink. My hired hands hate it. You want to try it with that horse? We'll split what comes off it. 60 for you, 40 for me. If nothing grows, at least it will stop looking like a place men go to hide stolen cars." The next morning, Mercy and I stood at the edge of that field before sunrise. The plow handles felt strange in my palms. I had spent years steering diesel, not iron. Mercy took one step, then another, slow enough to embarrass any man who still measured work by speed. The first furrow was ugly. The second was worse. By noon, my hands had opened into blisters, my shoulders burned, and the plow had struck so many buried rocks, I started hearing that metal clang even when it was not there. A neighbor drove by in a pickup and slowed just long enough to stare. Half the county knew Caleb Ward had gone backward 100 years. Maybe I had, but backward was the only direction the bank had not taken from me. The field fought me every inch. Tree roots grabbed the share. Clay stuck to the moldboard in heavy slabs. I hauled stones by hand and stacked them along the fence until my fingers could no longer straighten. When the plow beam cracked, I repaired it with a piece of scrap oak pulled from Nolan's collapsed corn crib. When the clevis bent, I heated it over a barrel fire and hammered it straight on an old drawbar. Mercy taught me the part I had forgotten. A tractor lets a man pretend the land is only a surface to cross. A horse forces him to feel it. She slowed at soft patches before I saw them. She leaned differently when the soil changed. Dead twice, refusing to pull, and both times the ground ahead was too wet to turn without ruining the structure. By the end of October, I had opened 12 acres. 12 acres did not sound like much to men running 4,000 with GPS screens and air-conditioned cabs. But when I stood there in the cold dusk and looked at those dark strips laid across ground everyone had abandoned, I felt my name come back to me. Winter came mean. The pump house walls sweated frost. I slept wearing 2 coats and kept my boots inside the bedroll so they would not freeze stiff. I cooked beans on a camp stove and traded fence repair for cornmeal, onions, and eggs. Mercy slept in Nolan's empty loafing shed, warm under a blanket stitched from old seed sacks. At night, with a lantern on the floor and wind pressing against the stones, I studied. I read extension bulletins until the paper corners curled from damp. I learned which crops tolerated heat, which roots opened clay, which cover mixtures could feed soil without a banknote for fertilizer. I made charts on brown grocery sacks because I could not afford notebooks. The answer did not come from one miracle. It came from old knowledge everybody had driven past. A retired county agent named Miss Lila Park kept a file cabinet in the back room of the library. She had saved pamphlets on horse cultivation, dryland cover cropping, heirloom seed trials, and interplanting systems that had once fed families on ground too poor for single-crop thinking. One afternoon, she placed a flyer in front of me. The state college was looking for small growers willing to document low-input field trials. They offered seed, soil testing, technical visits, and a guaranteed buyer for heritage grain and dry beans. The catch was paperwork. Lots of it. Planting notes, rainfall logs, weed pressure, labor hours, yields by row. Most big operators ignored it. I filled out the application in pencil over 3 nights, pressing so hard the words left grooves in the table. In February, a letter arrived. Accepted. Inside were vouchers for seed, painted mountain corn, pinto beans, winter squash, sorghum, cowpeas, buckwheat, and a small packet of prairie grass mix, meant to hold the creek bank from washing farther away. For the first time in months, I held paper from an institution that did not say I owed them. Spring did not arrive gently. It came as mud, wind, and one late freeze that blackened the cottonwood buds. I planted anyway. Not like I used to plant. No straight ocean of wheat from road to horizon. No single bet big enough to ruin a man. I broke the field into smaller patches that followed the shape of the soil. On the higher ground I put sorghum and cowpeas where the roots could work deep. In the darker strips I planted corn, beans, and squash together, the stalks lifting the beans, the vines shading the ground, the whole field acting less like a factory and more like a living argument against waste. Every seed felt personal. I dropped them by hand, covered them with a hoe, marked rows with stakes cut from willow, and wrote the date in a log Miss Park had given me. Mercy pulled a 1-row cultivator so slowly that children walking home from school could have kept pace. Walking home from school could have kept pace. They laughed at first. Then the rains missed us. In June, the conventional fields around town began to curl. Wheat heads went pale. Corn leaves rolled tight by noon. Men gathered at the elevator and stared at the sky like jurors waiting for a verdict. My creek field did not look rich. It looked scrappy, uneven, and strange. But it stayed green. The squash shaded the soil. The cowpeas held their color. The buckwheat flowered so thick with bees that the whole patch seemed to hum. When a state college researcher came out to take pictures, he knelt down and pushed his fingers into the soil. "It's cooler under here," he said, lifting a squash leaf. I almost laughed. That was not science to me. That was shade. But there was science in it, too. Water stayed where the vines covered it. Roots opened spaces the clay had kept closed. Different plants borrowed and paid back in ways one crop alone never could. By late July, men who had crossed the street to avoid me were slowing beside the creek. Not all of them came to admire. Some came to measure. Some came to find the trick. One man said the college must have given me special seed. Another said a field that small did not prove anything. Maybe he was right. But a man sleeping in a pump house does not need to prove the world wrong all at once. He only needs tomorrow to be possible. The darkest moment came 3 weeks before harvest, and from the west with green-black clouds and wind hard enough to flatten road signs. I stood under the pump house doorway, listening to hail hit the roof like handfuls of gravel. For 20 minutes I could not see the field. Only white streaks, dust, and leaves tearing sideways through the dark. I thought, this is it. The bank could take equipment. Drought could take yield. But hail took without leaving a man anything to argue with. When the storm passed, I walked to the creek ground with my stomach hollow. The sorghum on the high edge was shredded. Corn leaves hung in strips. Squash vines were torn open and muddy. I stood there so long, Mercy nudged my shoulder, as if even she knew grief had to be interrupted before it swallowed a man whole. Then I saw the beans. Under the broken corn and the battered leaves, the beans were still tied to the stalks. The squash crowns were bruised but alive. The cowpeas, low and stubborn, had bent instead of breaking. The field was wounded, not finished. So we went back to work. I cut damaged stalks by hand. I fed broken vines into compost piles. I propped the heaviest bean rows with branches and tied them with baling twine. For 16 days, from first light until I could not see my own hands, I salvaged what could still become food. That fall, the harvest did not look like a miracle from the road. It looked like sacks. Sacks of beans stacked in Nolan's shed, crates of squash with healed scars on their skins, sorghum heads hanging from rafters, corn dried on racks I built from scrap lumber. The numbers came later. 12 acres produced enough contracted crop to pay Nolan his share, pay my overdue feed bill, buy winter hay for Mercy, replace my bedroll with a used cot, and put $3,800 in a coffee can I hid under a loose stone in the pump house. I read the total 3 times because I did not trust my own arithmetic. So I did not trust my own arithmetic. For years I had farmed more land, burned more fuel, signed bigger notes, and still felt poorer by Thanksgiving. Now I had worked 12 rejected acres with 1 old horse, and had money left after the bills. That was when the story changed. The college asked me to keep records another season. Nolan offered the rest of the bottomland. I leased a small trailer, and parked it beside the pump house, though I still kept my lantern there like a reminder. By the second year, I had 38 acres in rotation. By the third, 56. People stopped calling it foolish and started calling it low-input diversification, which sounded expensive enough to be respectable. Reporters came, researchers came, young growers came with notebooks. The same men who had laughed from their pickups now asked how deep I planted cowpeas and what I used for mulch. I answered them because bitterness is another kind of debt, and I had already carried enough. Mara came back during the third harvest. She stepped out of her mother's car wearing a blue dress and the cautious face of someone afraid hope might be a trick. The children ran past her toward the squash rows, shouting at the size of everything. My youngest boy, the one whose hospital bills had helped break us, carried a crooked pumpkin with both arms and grinned like he had discovered treasure. Mara looked at the field, then at the trailer, then at Mercy standing under the cottonwoods, flicking flies with her tail like a queen inspecting her country. "You built this?" she asked. I wanted to say something grand. All I could say was, "Not alone." We took things slowly. Trust, like soil, does not return because a man demands it. It returns when enough small things are done right for long enough. The next spring, Nolan did what the bank had never done. Me at his kitchen table, pushed a deed across the oilcloth, and said, "This ground knows your hands now. Buy it from me at what I paid, and I'll carry the note." No committee, no algorithm. No man in a city office deciding the worth of soil he had never smelled. Just a handshake. I paid that note off in 6 years. Mercy lived to 29. On her last morning, she stood in the pasture with sunlight across her back and her head resting against my chest. I buried her at the edge of the first 12 acres, under a cottonwood that had survived the storm. Today, I own 94 acres, not 270. I do not call that smaller. The farm employs 4 people in season and feeds families through markets, restaurants, and a winter grain cooperative. We keep records the college still uses. We teach young farmers how to read soil before they read loan papers. Some years are lean, some years are generous, but no single crop, no single machine, and no single bank can take the whole thing down. The old farm came up for sale once. The bank's buyer had mined it hard, planted it fence to fence, and left the topsoil light enough to move in a stiff wind. I had the money to bid. I did not. That land belonged to the man who thought acres made him safe. I am not that man anymore. Every morning I pass the old walking plow mounted beside the shed door. Its handles are smooth from my palms. Its blade is pitted and dull. Most visitors see a relic. I see the moment the bank miscounted. They took the machines. They took the house. Of me that believed bigger always meant stronger. But they left Mercy. They left the plow. and they left enough ground for a ruined man to learn the difference between what is valuable and what is merely expensive.